Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network, which was formerly the Manning Center. I want to welcome you to this month's exchange call, Is China at War with the West? But first, I want to make just a quick announcement. Our fall networking conference has been posted on our website, just put it up this week. We're holding 2 events this fall. November 6th is a best practices forum. That's not an issue discussion, it's an exchange of ideas and best practices to have the best effect for our organization and our efforts. And then on November 7th, we're doing our annual issues conference that deals with a whole range of topics that are relevant. So registration is open for those 2 events. I regret that we can't meet in person, but they will be online this fall, and then we'll look again in the spring as to how we're doing at that time for that. We are honored to have 2 fantastic guests with us today. I'm not going to read their full bios, that would take too long, but I will recognize the think tanks that they are with. Dr. Charles Burton is a friend of ours, MacDonald Laurier Institute. He spoke with us last spring in Ottawa at our national conference. And retired Brigadier General of the U.S. Air Force, Dr. Robert Spalding. Very pleased to have you with us, sir. And he is with the Hudson Institute. We can see off his back shoulder there. Also joining us today is Lieutenant Commander Michael St. Pierre, the Canadian Armed Forces. Michael works in clearance diving and bomb disposal. You are a brave soul, sir. I tell you, it's incredible work, and thank you for your service. Michael has expertise in national security, and so he has forgotten more about issues like China than I will know. So it definitely helps these calls when we can have people come on. And Michael will be asking questions. He'll run through most of the questions today. We're going to do 5 topics, and then we're going to have a hard stop at the top of the hour and take some questions. Now, I've had a lot of feedback on these exchange calls, and what keeps coming up is not enough time for questions, not enough time for questions. So we are going to keep it tight to 1 hour if we can get inside that a bit. And you are welcome to stay with us for 75 minutes, and I welcome your feedback about the longer time for this. We encourage you, please put comments into the chat, and we'll ask our speakers to put the chat on as well to look and to see. And as you're talking, if relevant points come up during that, you can certainly respond to that. If you want to put questions, put them in the Q&A. Mike and I will be reviewing that, and toward the end, we'll get through that and try and find themes and try to get the best questions that we can with the time we have limited. Yes, the call will be recorded, and we'll have that posted shortly after that. So with that, let us get started. Dr. Spalding, your book is about the West sleeping through a stealth war. So what is China's modus operandi? How long have we, the democratic West, been sleeping? And I want to bridge immediately to the most common question that came in before we went on today, and that is, how does China's handling of the coronavirus fit with the idea of a stealth war? I'll turn it over to you, General. And again, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be back with Dr. Burton again. I enjoyed our time on the podcast, so and thank you for inviting me to speak. If you think about what the world was prior to China entering the WTO, you know, the end of the Cold War, the kind of hype about the unipolar moment, the end of history. And then going into 2007 with the introduction of the iPhone, you really, in addition to China entering the WTO and the reordering of the global supply chain to really be centered on China, you've had a reordering of the global economy from really an industrial economy to an information economy. And that occurred roughly in the late 2000s. And over the course of between 2007 and 2018, you had a great shift in where value was oriented. So it was valued in industrial. So AT&T, General Electric, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, Shell were kind of the top 5 in market cap. And then 10 years later, you have Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. In conjunction with that, you had this really ability to use data across borders in ways that propelled those companies to great wealth. And that was the ability to use data about individuals to influence them to be better consumers of your product. Now, this is something that the Chinese Communist Party recognized very early and adapted and adopted to their system. You know, when they entered the WTO, one of the comments that's frequently repeated is Clinton's, you know, admonition that controlling the internet's like nailing Jello to the wall. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party recognized after the Tiananmen massacre that they had to, you know, control the influx of ideas surrounding democratic principles into China, but they still needed the science and technology and the talent to come in. And so they went about crafting a society that actually uses data to not only influence economic choices, but also social and political choices. And then what we did is we connected the entire world together in this global information economy, and the Chinese Communist Party found that they could deploy this influence mechanism across their borders. And one of the easiest way to explain this is WeChat, where you have over 1 billion users, mostly Chinese language speakers, where the Chinese Communist Party is able to, because of that platform, extend the Great Firewall to the entire globe. In fact, when I was at the Pentagon back in 2015, talking to a young researcher from China, she mentioned that she landed at Dulles Airport and sent a WeChat message to her friend in Maryland that never arrived because the Chinese Communist Party blocked it because her friend had left China during the Tiananmen massacre time. So it is really how Silicon Valley created an ability to undermine the principles and institutions of the democratic West that the Chinese Communist Party has adapted and adopted and essentially used in their global campaign to basically perpetuate their own rule, but in order to do so, really diminish support for the principles and values of the liberal democratic order, that really provided the foundation for the end of the Cold War and the post Cold War world. So it is a completely different world when it comes to national security, when Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines in the U.S. is really ineffectual when it comes to protecting our own citizens from foreign influence. When you pair that with the ability of other groups to undermine the democratic system based on ideology of Marxism and things like critical race theory, which are really a revision of the post-modernist thought, and it's really more of a applied postmodernist thought. You have this symmetry between what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, which is to control the narrative for their own interests, with the effort on behalf of those applied postmodernists to essentially deconstruct liberal Western democratic order that's based on rational thought and the scientific method in order to create a different power structure. And so they work hand in hand, and the coronavirus is the first time that we actually see them coming together in really, really close ways. The Chinese Communist Party, 40% of the social media posts with regard to the coronavirus are from bots. Really strong disinformation and influence campaigns following the coronavirus. Of course, the spread of that pandemic was specifically done by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. You can see the timeline from the time Xi Jinping's in charge of what's going on in Wuhan on the 7th of January to international travel, blocking domestic travel, lockdown of PPE and masks, and all of that. And then at the tail end of that, you have the rioting and looting from Antifa and BLM in the United States that really is not based on social justice in the way that we have pursued it typically in liberal democracies, which is really about economic opportunity and equality under the law. It's really designed to create a caste system on the basis of identity. And so in a way, it is controlling the narrative, much like the Chinese Communist Party is controlling narrative, controlling speech in order to control thought. And so This is a full out assault on the liberal democratic order. It was basically the tools, the apps, the services, the business models of Silicon Valley that were created and then adopted by authoritarians was entirely created in the West. The environment for that, it sprung up in case of the postmodernists in Western academia. We've created this system that is really designed to destroy modernity today, and it's far more existential a threat to institutions and democracies than terrorism ever was.
Yeah. Charles, the same question to you, but I'll also maybe ask you to touch a bit on the ambitions and leadership of Xi Jinping specifically, because I've heard you talk about some of those key speeches he gave at the beginning of his tenure as well.
Yes, well, I think that what General Spalding says is so true in terms of the Chinese ability to manipulate the discourse in the West in ways that we're not able to do inside of China. But certainly, if you look at the leadership of Party General Secretary Xi, unlike his predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, Xi is not interested in legitimizing his Chinese Communist Party's continued autocratic rule over China by a promise of, getting into compliance with international norms or political democratization at some time in the future. He really has changed the discourse over to the kind of thing that General Spalding is talking about, which is a blatant attempt to discredit the principles of truth and citizenship, which are so central to our way of being in the free world. So this also involves the Chinese Communist Party's desire to discredit and eventually, I think, send into irrelevance the global institutions of trade and diplomacy, which regulate a rules-based international order. So in his speech to the 19th Party Congress a couple of years ago, Xi Jinping stressed the idea of what's called the community of the common destiny of mankind. And what this really is a desire to restructure all global institutions towards China on the assumption, a wrong assumption in my view, that the United States is a power in terminal decline and that China will come to the fore to fill the vacuum of a superpower, and that it will be on the basis of Chinese values as defined. In other words, an explicit rejection of Western liberal values replaced by the values which inform the current authoritarian Chinese Communist Party one-party regime, and supplemented by a reorientation of the global economy through what the Chinese describe as the Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, a massive infrastructure program designed to, with the belts, put in high-speed rail and road all the way from China through Eurasia, and the road being the Maritime Silk Road, which is a series of upgraded port facilities. All of these belts and roads terminate in China. So it's actually based on an interpretation of Chinese history, which is that China, 中国 in Chinese meaning Middle Kingdom, was historically the preeminent global civilization, and all other nations should be subordinate to China and provide tribute. And so under Mr. Xi, there seems to be an aspiration to recreate that traditional order where the entire global community is subordinate to China, and that Chinese culture and values will become the universal culture of mankind. So from that point of view, it's an audacious and ambitious plan, not necessarily able to be implemented because there are so many unknown factors, but certainly through what they define as the digital Silk Road, there is a desire on the part of China to impose through technological means their own discourse on nations throughout the world, particularly in third world dictatorships. But I think ultimately, if China is able to get the Huawei 5G technology to dominate all global telecommunications everywhere, and under those circumstances, this dream, what they call the Great China Dream of national reunification, anyway, it's the massive dream of the re-rise of China, which would be implemented, and the ambition is to achieve this by the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 2050, redress the past humiliations of Western imperialism from the First Opium War in 1840, and reestablish this global order under China. So, you know, the kind of thing that General Spalding is talking about are the kind of stealthy warlike devices that could, in fact, make this happen. But certainly for myself, I don't want to live in a world that's not based on values of citizenship and liberal democracy. And I hope that, you know, the global community can become aware of what's going on and insist that our governments respond in a vigorous way to prevent it from happening.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. General Spalding and Dr. Burton, China is a mixed bag. Capitalism has helped advance its wealth and prosperity significantly. But while it has done that, it's also a totalitarian and authoritarian state-run capitalism. What is this mix, and how do we deal with it? And what's the best historical lens to look at this regime and its spread both physically and digitally?
Well, I mean, I'll just give you two examples that just recently came out in the news within the last month. XPeng, which is an electric car manufacturer, which is stolen technology from Tesla and Apple, just raised $1.5 billion on the New York Stock Exchange, and that mostly from probably retirees in the U.S. At the same time, Tesla just announced it's suing the United States government for imposing tariffs on parts coming out of China. So it is this failure to recognize that, you know, through globalization and the internet, the Chinese Communist Party have not only eroded economic opportunity and prosperity in the West, but have really, with the internet, captured the narrative. And so between the two, and finally with their access to capital on Wall Street, between the three, it is really a trifecta that undermines what was the strength that led us to victory in the Cold War, which is, you know, liberal democracies tend to, you know, produce happy, you know, productive people. If you don't take the bounty of that happy, productive people, which is innovation, technology, talent, and capital, and reinvest it in those societies, they tend to die over time. And that's what's been happening. That innovation, technology, and talent and capital has been funneled into China for the purpose of building a totalitarian regime that favors its own, you know, resurgence. So this is really the challenge that we have today is corporate America, Wall Street in the US, really around the world, these multinational corporations and the financial centers around the world are really in the Chinese Communist Party's camp. If you looked at their stock over the last year, in spite of everything that's going on, it's risen 20%. And that's because, you know, over 200 billion US dollars have flown through Hong Kong into China to promote China's rise. So while everybody's realizing that there's a threat to democracy, the corporations and the financiers of the world are basically helping them grow.
Well, I agree with General Spalding very much, and I think the key here is totalitarian. You know, if you look at a company like Huawei, Huawei claims to be, a strong corporate citizen and a competitor in a comparable way to Scandinavian firms like Ericsson and Nokia, or even Samsung. And one might look at it and say, well, why is Huawei so successful? You know, they have the wolf culture, which makes them particularly aggressive. Maybe they sometimes go a bit over the edge. You know, we know about the Huawei employee incentive program for providing stolen software or hardware solutions to assist Huawei. You know, and perhaps they do receive some sort of hidden benefits from the Chinese government that allows them to price their equipment more competitively. And then there's the issue of the security, the National Intelligence Law of 2017 that requires all Chinese citizens to collaborate with Chinese state security and military intelligence. You know, the Huawei leader, Ren Zhengfei, has vehemently denied that he would allow his company to do such a thing, because it would be in violation of the laws of the nations in which Huawei has sub-companies, you know, Huawei Canada, a sponsor of Hockey Night in Canada. So this is all a deception, because the issue of whether or not Huawei would respond to requests from the Chinese Communist Party to engage in facilitating cyber espionage or purloining massive databases of personnel files to serve China's intelligence interests is far understating the case. Huawei's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party is not a master-servant relationship. It's a symbiotic relationship. Huawei's mandate is to achieve the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not simply they try and downplay the role of their Chinese Communist Party committee. Huawei is the Chinese state. It has full access to all the resources of the Chinese state, money, you know, intelligence. If Huawei needs to know how to make their bid against Samsung more competitive, the Chinese intelligence services will provide them with that information. And they're required to serve the interests of the Chinese state in every way that they can, including in terms of providing the Chinese state with information about infrastructure, kill switches, any kind of data that the state deems is necessary to fulfill the terms of the National 5-Year Plan. So this is really not about, you know, China enters capitalism and there are successful Chinese firms which, you know, should be considered equivalent to the successful firms of liberal democratic nations. This is the use of this capitalist system abroad and a deceptive discourse to further realize the Chinese Communist Party's overall domestic and international goals. And Huawei is a component part of that, not simply an element of it.
Sir, Dr. Burton, thank you. Days are numbered for Hong Kong. Brings to question, how long does Taiwan hold out? And then on the more personal level, we have 2 Canadian citizens, the 2 Michaels, held in China. Is this simply collateral damage in a new and far more complicated Cold War? And with reference to the national security law beyond China's borders, what about Chinese Communist Party members within our own Western democratic states?
I think Hong Kong, of course, is gone. I think everybody realizes that. I do think Taiwan's in danger. I don't think the West has done much favors by allowing the buildup of such an imbalance in power, military power on the other side of the strait. I think we've been derelict in keeping up with that and certainly providing the type of weapon systems that could effectively and efficiently counter. We've created weapon systems that and militaries that fight very well in the Middle East and Europe, but quite frankly, don't travel well in the Pacific. So we've got a problem that needs to be addressed. That's one of the reasons the Trump administration pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, because of all the conventional ballistic and cruise missiles that the Chinese Communist Party deployed in the Pacific. And this idea of hostage diplomacy, I mean, when I was a defense attaché in Beijing, you know, if you came through Shanghai on your way to Japan as a military member, they'd pull you off the plane and detain you. So I think this kind of behavior by the Chinese state is one that we've been slow to recognize and deal with and aggressively push back on. You know, I think, you know, this is something that we're going to have to deal with, you know, and I've been very vocal in telling people that I don't think they should travel to China. I think it's locking down. The more the world begins to deal with the Chinese state as it is and the Chinese Communist Party as it is, the more aggressively and vigorously they're going to respond to that. And the ones that are collateral damage in that are going to be the citizens of the free world that find themselves, you know, in the clutches or in the mainland. And this is a big problem. And what's going to have to happen, and I think what's been happening with the diplomatic efforts of the United States, is we need to come together as democracies to fight this kind of behavior, because you know, at the end of the day, it's unacceptable for, you know, what they're doing to not only those Canadians, but Australians, other Americans. You know, this is going to go on, and we got to stand together and really deal with it.
Yes, I agree with everything that the General has said. I do think that it's likely that the kind of stealth war tactics that General referred to in his earlier answer is the approach of China to Taiwan, and they really do put a lot of effort into disinformation in Taiwan, and the government of Taiwan is trying to counter it by, you know, providing services that allow you to see if what you're reading is true or not. But there's a lot of money involved in subversion of media in Taiwan by mainland forces, and Taiwan, being a free and open society, has a lot of difficulty in preventing this kind of cancer on their the liberal democratic basis for modern Taiwan to not spread. So I am concerned about the future of Taiwan. You know, there's certainly no question that the current government of Taiwan is a legitimate representative of the people of Taiwan. Like many people, I went and monitored the most recent election, and you know, it's a democratic country that for whom that government represents the aspirations of their people. With regard to the other matter of hostage diplomacy, and clearly China will engage in this kind of behavior so long as it serves Chinese interests. And you know, we have significant elite co-optation by the Chinese regime in Canada. There are a lot of important Canadian multinational corporations who have significant lucrative arrangements with Chinese communist business networks. And these companies, naturally, as they're creators of prosperity and employment in Canada, have significant influence at the most senior levels of our government. And because of what I was alluding to before, the symbiotic relationship between the interests of the Chinese communist regime overall and its, you know, these state-owned or Chinese government-associated companies, or really all Chinese companies, they're able to transmit a message within Canada that unless we do what China wants, that these corporate interests will suffer. And that includes, you know, significant numbers of retired policymakers who are able to achieve some degree of wealth through China associations after they leave public service and are no longer involved in policymaking over China. So, you know, in the case of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Svaver, what the Chinese government has done is obviously outrageous. I think to some extent, the government was hoping that this matter of Kovrig and Svaver would fade from public attention over time, and that would not be disruptive to our overall economic interests inside China. That has not come to pass. But, you know, subsequently, the Chinese government, with a view to getting Canada to violate its treaty obligation with the United States with regard to extradition over the request by the US authorities to to detain the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, who is alleged to have committed serious crimes of fraud. Chinese government is extremely keen to see Ms. Meng released. They feel that it's a test of strength with Canada, that Canada has not, would dare to arrest such a key person in their regime. And therefore, they've arrested Kovriken's favor, and they've engaged in violation of trade agreements, such as, abrogating $3 billion a year of export of canola seeds on grounds which are false grounds, claim that the canola seeds are contaminated. It's simply not true. None of our other canola seed customers feel that Canada's product is anything but a very fine product. So, the Canadian government has not engaged in any retaliation whatsoever with regard to China's mistreatment of Canada, despite the fact that our overall external trade to China is only 4% of our, actually since the canola seed fiasco, more like 3.7% of our external trade compared to over 75% that goes to the United States of America. So by continuing to collaborate with Chinese state purposes, not challenging pervasive use of Chinese agents within Canada engaged in influence and menacing and coercion operations, and by not cracking down on Chinese state purloining of classified technologies that are transferred to agents of the Chinese state. Our legislation to counter this is much weaker than that of our allies. And by not making a clear signal with regard to the danger to our security and global security of Huawei 5G, we're empowering the Chinese regime to keep holding Kovriken's favor and, in fact, to do more. So our government's response is very distressing. And it may be that with an election coming up in Canada, and because the Conservative Party now has a very strong statement on China policy, that we'll see the government doing something, but certainly it's not something that the government elites want to do. I think it's only if there's sufficient public demand. And the two things that the government is currently considering doing, aside from the Huawei 5G, I think to stave off public opprobrium, is considering offering safe harbor to the heroic young freedom fighters in Hong Kong who are facing the prospect of political persecution under the new national security law, and considering putting some Chinese officials on our Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, our Magnitsky list, who are complicit in enormous gross violations of the norms of human rights and possibly genocide with regard to the concentration camps directed at the Turkic Muslims living in the northwestern region of China. So, the problem is certainly China, but the other problem is us and our government's inability to act in any way which properly defends Canada's short-term, medium-term, and long-term interests with regard to our engagement with the People's Republic of China.
Am I wrong to say that we're approaching a critical juncture in a bifurcation of the global world order? Is decoupling inevitable? And if so, what are those implications? Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain, a new division of East and West? And if so, what happens to traditional alliances and institutions such as the WTO, WHO, UN, our security arrangements in NATO, the ABCAN's Five Eyes community? And then further on down, what does this do to the domestic economy and manufacturing sector, trade, our pension funds, production of essential and non-essential goods? I know that's a lot there. And one more, if I can make it any more difficult, timing. How long does this decoupling take, and how do the dominoes fall?
I do think the decoupling is not only inevitable, it's happening as we speak. despite the fact that these multinational corporations and financiers are trying as hard as they can to prevent it. I do think it's going to take in the order of 5 to 10 years to really see a sea change in because it takes time to move these supply chains. It doesn't happen overnight. That being said, I think what we should explore is what happens if we don't do that. During the Cold War, we had something called COCOM, which was essentially mandatory export and trade restrictions that the Allies were bound to honor. And that we knew that we did that because we understood the importance of the innovation and technology that comes out of the free world and certainly the capital, and how dangerous that would be if we had shared that with the Soviet Union to our own security. What's happened is there's been a bifurcation in security relationships and trade and economic relationships in a way that's not sustainable to promoting the interests of the free world. And so what the Trump administration has been trying to do, and what has not been accurately portrayed in the media, is to approach each of our allies and partners on a bilateral basis and explain that this continued division between the security relationship and economic and trade relationships is unsustainable if we want to preserve our democracies. And so we have to reorder that. So the first thing to go was NAFTA, and NAFTA not in a way that was meant to be punishing, but really to realize that if we aren't strongly aligned economically, financially, trade-wise, then the security relationships that we have really have no meaning. One of the examples of this is kind of the massive influx of goods on either side of the U.S. border, because the U.S. has this policy that says if it's less than $800 of value, it can come into the country tax-free. So it's one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party undermines the fiber that binds free societies. And so we have to work strongly together, recognize that they have a million different ways to collapse the free world by essentially breaking them up and making them divisive. And so Chorus, the Japan agreement, what I think is going to be a UK-US free trade agreement, and the EU. So these are all designed to, essentially repair some of the lingering challenges that we had from the Cold War. The uneven trading relationships were on the basis of this quid pro quo between the United States and our allies that said we would protect against the Soviet Union, and we would promote the economies of the free world and really lower the barriers to trade with us in order to sustain that collective group through the Cold War. They weren't changed after the Cold War ended. And so it's ended up in policies where you have, like with the EU, for example, you have a 10% tariff on a US car in Europe and a 2.5% tariff on a European car in the US. It's just not a sustainable model if we want to really work together to create this really free trade order that's based on also promoting democratic principles, rule of law, civil liberties, and human rights. We can't have one or the other. So I think the question is, if we don't do this, what happens? And I tell you from looking at this for a very long time, what you see eventually is a collapse of the international order and its ability to promote liberal democratic values, because it no longer has the strength of those growing economies to back it up. So, it was the economy that defeated the Soviet Union. And if you look at what the Chinese Communist Party has been able to construct, it is exactly the opposite of what it was during the Cold War, which is the US and other free world economies are collapsing while China's are growing more powerful. And that's essentially not a recipe for us to be successful. The Cold War was not won with bombs and bullets. It was won with economics and finance. The only addition to this war is the new addition of the global internet, or information, as a key component of that. And so I think as we begin to align our economic, financial, trade, and informational relationships to coincide with our security relationships, and those become more fulsome and complete, much like COCOM was during the Cold War, you're going to see the Chinese Communist Party increasingly isolated. Its ability to generate the kind of growth that it's had over the last 30 years is not going to be sustainable. The only reason it was is because of the innovation, technology, talent, and capital from the West. So I think that's the goal, is to really sew up this liberal democratic order and really begin to act collectively again. And that had to happen first on a bilateral basis. It was a dialogue based on what are our shared interests and values and how do we promote them together going forward?
If I could, I do think that the fact that only the United States, under Secretary of State Pompeo largely, has been challenging China's violations of the international rules-based order is quite disturbing. And we don't see up to now any kind of meaningful alliance of like-minded medium powers, hopefully under the leadership of the United States, to challenge the asymmetrical power relationship that currently exists between a country like Canada and a country like China. So, we really do need to make it clear to the Chinese regime that if they want to engage with us and have us engage with them, that they have to respect the rules of the game, or there will be consequences for them. The question really is whether China needs us that much to acquiesce to becoming into compliance with these kinds of principles of fairness and reciprocity, which make global interaction work and which preserve the interests of lesser powers. It's not looking like things are moving in that direction under Xi Jinping. As I said before, this community of the common destiny of mankind is precedented on replacement Chinese-dominated institutions for all those institutions that Michael mentioned, the WTO, the UN, the WHO, NATO, etc., that those would gradually fade into irrelevance as China debases them, and certainly in China's role in the UN is obviously highly disruptive in terms of China's obvious rejection of the principles of the UN Charter and China's gross violations of the WTO, also debates the integrity of that institution, and China's ignoring the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, by its rejection of the Court of Arbitration in The Hague's determination that rocky outcroppings and reefs that are being land reclaimed by the Chinese military to turn into military installations is a violation because those are in fact international waters and so on. So, from that point of view, China has been putting key members of the Chinese Communist Party into key roles in multilateral institutions, including Interpol, who seem to function in a way to reorient those institutions towards China's overall interests. So the question is, what can be done about this? Will the world split into a Chinese-led group and the rest of us struggling, maybe by diversifying our trade to the Trans-Pacific Partnership or other devices? I think it's too soon to say. I still maintain some confidence that, this current horrendous Chinese regime will not sustain and will be perceived by the people of China as not representing its interests, and that they will demand that a different kind of Chinese regime based on a different interpretation of history, not one which is about let's redress the humiliations of the past starting with 1840, but one which is a bit more forward-looking and based on universal values of human rights and citizenship will come to the fore. And under those circumstances, we could be building a world based on, as General Spalding says, liberal democratic values and the promotion of common prosperity. But right now, the situation is looking pretty grave. And in many ways, countries like Canada are enabling the current regime in China by allowing them to continue to expand their grasp in our country without any kind of effective response. So I guess on the one hand, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, maybe more realistically, I'm pessimistic.
Last question before we go to some questions that are coming in, and thank you everybody for sending some of those in. This is a call for policymakers, advocates, and people in the public policy sphere. So what I want to do, and you've touched on a lot of this in your comments, and thank you, the excellent comments, and we're getting a lot of favorable feedback on that. What if you were to summarize, say, 4 or 5 things that we as civil society organizations, even partisans, should be pushing our governments for, particularly in this country in terms of policy as it pertains to China? If we were to focus on a couple of sort of key things in terms of the work that we're doing with organizations like this and others. And I'll probably maybe start with you, Charles, first, and then go to the General.
Thank you, Troy. Well, I think, one fundamental thing is that our Senate, Senator Yuanpao Wu, has placed a statement on his website based on a closed consultation opposing the idea of Canada considering any kind of legislation comparable to the Australian legislation of 2018, the Foreign Influence Transparency Act. And so this legislation is, designed to ensure that policymakers who are receipt of benefit from foreign powers should be, revealing that publicly, like on the principle of sunshine is the best disinfectant. And after that act was promulgated in Australia, a number of senior Australians resigned from Chinese associated boards and other affiliations. I mean, most notably, the Australian former Minister of International Trade, Andrew Robb, who negotiated the free trade deal that China wanted Canada to more or less cut and paste for ourselves. And thank goodness our people in the Department of Justice had a look at it and realized that it's a terrible, bad deal that favors China significantly, and we have not done that. But Mr. Robb negotiated the free trade deal, and he negotiated the lease of the Australian port of Darwin to a Chinese billionaire on a 99-year basis. And then it was discovered that Mr. Robb was in receipt of an $800,000 a year private consultancy from the same billionaire. No law violated. Clearly, some people are able to ask for a lot more consulting fees than persons like myself. So there's no suggestion that Mr. Robb has violated the laws of Australia in any way, but he has resigned from that consultancy once the legislation came through. So the argument that's made in Canada is that nothing like that could possibly be going on in our country, and that the RCMP are fully, and collaboration with CSIS, are fully in command of any kind of subversion, covert, corrupt, coercive subversion of Canadians that would cause people in key positions to be representing the interests of the People's Republic of China rather than the interests of Canada. But I'm thinking that why don't we try this legislation and see how it goes? There's also suggestion it could violate Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So let's put it to a test. So that would at least start in terms of trying to establish why it is our government is not responding to China's threat to our national security and sovereignty in any meaningful way by making it clear the extent to which the Chinese regime may have influence here. So that would be an important one. I think in terms of other activities, I mean, clearly we should be cracking down on agents of the Chinese state in Canada much more rigorously than we have been. It's appalling that we haven't. We should obviously make a clear indication that Huawei 5G is not something that our government can approve, and that we should be standing up for our values internationally and trying to regain some credibility as defenders of liberal democracy by providing the refuge to the Hong Kong young people who are in trouble in Hong Kong now. They should be able to come to Canada. We have 600,000 Cantonese-speaking Canadians of Hong Kong origin. It's a very large number, and I'm sure that they would like to come to be with their family and friends, and that we should start to apply our Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act evenly based on the terms of the legislation. You know, right now we've got people from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Russia, South Sudan on that list, but not a single Chinese Communist official, even though I think by any objective measure, the degree of human rights violation by the Chinese regime would far exceed that of those countries that have in fact been identified by Canada and subjected to this kind of sanction. And it will be effective because there are significant numbers of senior people in the Chinese Communist regime who have considerable assets in our country. I mean, you know, Meng Wanzhou herself, why does she have 2 multi-million-dollar mansions in Vancouver? And why was she traveling with 7 passports when she was detained at the Vancouver airport? These are all questions that we'd want to explore. So I think that there are a number of things that the Canadian government could be doing as starters. And I hope that eventually, thanks to raising awareness by you know, civil society like your own, that our politicians will be compelled to listen more to the will of the people of Canada and protect our sovereignty and democracy than listening to corporate interests who may have reason to defend the Chinese regime against our own. So that's more or less a longish answer to a shortish question, Troy.
You know, the national security strategy is fairly straightforward, and the way we're going about it in the United States is under 3 fronts. It's protect, rebuild, and inspire. In the protect, it's really about identifying these connections to the Chinese Communist Party and the ways they undermine our society from within, and working with allies and partners to find policy solutions to them. And essentially, it is to prevent the innovation, technology, talent, and capital from our society from escaping our borders and winding up not in other democracies, but in rather in China's you know, backyard. And then, you know, in the rebuild phases, taking that technology, talent, innovation, and capital that's been going to China and really redirecting it to our own democratic societies. So rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding manufacturing, you know, investing in science and technology education, and investing in science and technology research and development. And finally, building an internet that protects our society. So, you know, we did have on page 19 of our national security strategy, we're going to build a nationwide secure 5G network. And what you may have missed is that the Department of Defense released an RFI last Friday to do just that, build a dual use, you know, military civilian nationwide network to protect our internet for the American people. And then finally on Inspire, you know, as our societies begin to prosper and grow and provide for their citizens again in a way that they haven't been able to, because we've had to essentially impoverish millions of people in the free world in order to bring, you know, millions in China out of poverty in order to perpetuate the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, that other nations will begin to look at the Western liberal democratic model and say, oh, that actually works to promote the well-being and allow citizens of those countries to reach their full potential. And then we have to use, and we have to work together to do this. You know, U.S. and allies and partners have to work together to be builders, not breakers. So we have in the United States, USAID, we have Export-Import Bank, we have Trade Development Agency, we have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we have now the newly formed Developmental Finance Corporation. Quite frankly, we haven't been using those things strategically like we did during the Marshall Plan. So it's really about using developmental finance combined with, you know, public diplomacy that promotes the values and principles of the liberal democratic order and works strategically to help those emerging market economies begin to grow. And as we do, we're going to see things, you know, begin to turn around. But it's really about protect, rebuild, and inspire. And we're 3 years into this national security strategy and trying to approach this in a different, completely different way. And there has been absolutely unbelievable attacks from within the Washington, D.C. Beltway on that effort to break away from the establishment and the promotion of many of the wealthy that have gotten rich on behalf of the many of millions of Americans and others around the world that have lost their livelihood and really found themselves disenfranchised from this system. So, you know, I think we're well on the way, and I think we're going to be just fine if we can stay the course.
Great. Wonderful.
Mike, are you seeing questions?
Mr. Lanigan, there's about 50 questions.
I thought one that I'll maybe just kick off because I've just been scrolling them as I've been listening at the same time. Fred McMahon, hi Fred, asked the question about whether there's any internal opposition inside of China. Is the regime fragile at all? I suspect I know the answer to this, but I thought it was an interesting comment to bring up that hasn't been touched on. So whoever wants to tackle that, or both of you speak to it briefly.
I can start off on that one. You know, Party General Secretary Xi has engaged in a campaign of purges of Chinese Communist Party factions on the basis of corruption, although, you know, I have yet to meet a Chinese Communist Party senior official whose lifestyle seems to be anywhere compatible with their legitimate salaries. So, you know, tax evasion, corruption, bribery, pretty easy to get people on that because that's just the norms of how that system works. And he's concentrated a lot of power in the office of the president, including debasing the conventional authority of the premier of the state council, Li Keqiang. So there are a lot of elements within the regime who I think are unhappy with Mr. Xi. You know, as I said with regard to the Magnitsky Law, you know, there are a lot of people who have investments in countries like Canada because we're a boat hold for possible factional instability that occurs in this kind of non-democratic system. So, you know, I think there is the potential for Mr. Xi to lose power. I think that there must be a lot of people in China who feel that their government's, you know, wolf warrior diplomacy, gross disinformation, suppression of the truth of the origins of the COVID-19 are causing them to feel that they're losing face and that they need better leaders who are better able to reflect the values and aspirations of the Chinese people. So, and then of course there's the other factor that I imagine the general could speak of with more authority than me, which is the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army. And we don't have a lot of information about, you know, differing political perspectives in that obviously very important institution. So I think that there is hope. You know, we saw quite a dramatic change in the Soviet Union with the end of the Brezhnev era. And I can't help but think that we might see some rapid and pleasing change in China, but there is no evidence of it. There are no Lech Walesas or Václav Havels that we're aware of who have any significant support within China. So if it happens, it's going to be something that happens without me having predicted it. So
I'll use an example from American football. So it does happen every once in a while that a running back who's kind of a smaller person on the team finds himself surrounded, but then behind him is all of the offensive linemen, which probably outweigh him by, you know, twice his weight. And then they pick him up and the scrum begins to move in the direction that the big offensive line is pushing. And so continues to carry the running back who would normally go down very easily forward. And so in this analogy, the small running back is the Chinese Communist Party, and the offensive lineman is really the multinational corporations and the financiers in the free world that are essentially enabling this, you know, this dastardly party to persist. You know, they can't do it alone, but as long as they have the free world's, you know, economic might behind them, they can do quite well. So, you know, it is our own enabling of their perpetuation that sustains them. And as long as we continue to do that, just like Charles has been saying, they're going to be just fine.
General Spalding, Dr. Burton. There's a question on the Wuhan virus, the origins, and the numbers reported in China. But on this, I know you're not epidemiologists and tracing the virus is quite difficult. Does this situation of the Wuhan virus reveal more about the narrative game and data control and the nature of a totalitarian regime than it does about perhaps the malevolent, purposeful, or accidental release of the virus?
Well, I can speak to that one. You know, it was impressive how the Chinese regime were able to lock people down and prevent the spread of COVID-19. But it was done by, you know, locking doors from the outside and trapping people in their accommodations for very long periods of time when there was even a whisper of the virus available. So, you know, it does show how effective a totalitarian police state can be in controlling its people to achieve state purposes. And in this case, you know, once the regime had figured out that they'd made horrendous errors in the earlier stages of this thing, they wanted to stop it before it got too bad. You know, certainly the limitations on movement within China were done well. The Chinese government insisting that we not prevent Chinese nationals from traveling to our country, you know, when the virus started to be rife, is appallingly distressing because of what's happened subsequently. So, you know, it has helped Chinese soft power, but I do think that all of the disinformation the Chinese regime has been issuing about the virus, you know, the ridiculous speculation that it came with American troops to World Military Games in Wuhan, or you know, or perhaps it came from Italy, or the Chinese extreme overreaction to a proposal by the government of Australia that there should be a neutral international investigation of the sources of the COVID-19 is causing the Chinese government to look less and less credible in the eyes of the world, and making us more and more suspicious that, in fact, Chinese regime could be culpable for the deaths of enormous numbers of people in China and abroad. So it's certainly a mixed bag, but you know, bottom line is that people around the world are continuing to die in large numbers, and in the meantime, China's more or less gone back to normal with regard to daily activities, because they do seem to be able to control it through extreme repressive measures and very sophisticated control of the spread of information, and of course enforcing compliance, which, you know, has been outstanding.
It is interesting to know that in the aftermath of the initial outbreak of the coronavirus and the death of the doctor that had tried to warn his colleagues, and the extreme outrage among the Chinese that, you know, now you have, you know, over 90% approval rate of the reaction to the coronavirus by the government officials that actually created the spread of it in the first place. I think the origin is really a red herring. I don't think we're going to know the origin, whether it came from a wet market or a lab. I think that's irrelevant. What we do know is that Xi Jinping himself was in charge in early January of the crisis and allowed the spread internationally while preventing the spread domestically, which indicated, you know, intent. And when you compare that, or when you pair that with locking down PPE and masks, not just in China, but around the world through proxies, in order to benefit from the ensuing aftermath, and the pressure on the World Health Organization to delay the announcement of human-to-human transmission, then you have, you know, just an incredible, you know, unbelievable, you know, really unprecedented attack on global society. And then that coincided with the kind of diplomatic campaign and disinformation and social media influence campaign that followed internationally. So it is, you know, as I was watching this play out, you know, you can go to page 145 to 149 of Unrestricted Warfare and basically read from the pages of that effort on behalf of Chao Liang and Wang Shangsui to kind of envision how the world, the open world, the globalized information dominated world could be used to undermine those institutions and societies that favored, you know, liberal democratic principles. So, I mean, it is a wonderful, you know, perfect, beautiful, and terrible example of unrestricted warfare.
And very effective inside China, incidentally, as a regular viewer of the Chinese national news. You know, every program, they list the statistics of how many people are infected in the United States and how many have died compared to the current rate of spread in China. And of course, you know. Right,
and you look at the United States. You know, when you pair with that with what's going on in the United States, you have essentially a narrative that President Trump is basically the reincarnation of Hitler, and he's perpetuated this attack on his own people, when in reality he's tried to defend the society from an attack that came from outside our borders. This is, you know, what I was talking about, this kind of this ability for the Chinese Communist Party to exploit the democratic systems and really turn them on themselves for self-destruction.
Yeah.
Boy, there's lots of questions. We're not going to get to them. I'm looking at the time. There's a few questions on government procurement. I think I know where you gentlemen will stand on that, but maybe just end, because it's so topical in Canada. And I don't know to what extent the general can answer this, but certainly Charles, what happens with the two Michaels? Where is this headed? What's your looking into the crystal ball? It's incredible that there's so many ex-politicians and diplomats still talking about a prisoner swap. Like, where is this? It's crazy to me. I think it's crazy to a lot of us, yet it's still part of the discussion. Where do you see this going? Where do you see this landing, as if you were to look into the crystal ball?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that sending out these signals to the Chinese regime that there are significant elements within Canada who would adopt the Chinese demand and simply, you know, in the face of our convention of the independent rule of law, just, you know, ignore what Justice Heather Holmes of the BC Superior Court is doing and drive Miss Meng to the airport to be sent back to China. You know, this is very disturbing. And that there was a 19-person letter, including 3 former Canadian foreign ministers and a Supreme Court justice and many other distinguished Canadians who urged that we do just that. And then there's a more recent one. Apparently, over 100 former diplomats have sent a letter to the government urging the same thing, although the names of those people have not been revealed. I think in general, you know, these people who are on these letters don't seriously believe that there's any possibility of our stopping the due process of law with regard to assessing the U.S. extradition request, but they do like to have their names known to the Chinese authorities, who would then presumably offer them some favors. And that 100 diplomat list the names of those diplomats may not be known to us, but I dare say that they may well have been conveyed to the Chinese authorities. And so, you know, it's there again, the Chinese subverting our democracy by dealing with people that I cannot admire for their loyalty to our country. I want to be careful what I say, but, you know, and I understand that people have the right to express their free opinion, but frankly, I believe that this sort of activity, and it's been undertaken in past times by even some former prime ministers, including Brown Mulroney and Jean Chrétien and so on, who have subsequently recanted what they'd originally suggested. You know, that these things are very damaging to us. And as I said before, the Chinese Communist Party will keep Kovriken's favor, as long as it continues to serve the interests of their agenda in Canada. As soon as it is negative for them, I'm confident that Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Svavor will be released, because the Chinese have not been able to articulate any kind of justification for holding them, although I am disturbed that we have not had any consular access to them since January. And frankly, I don't think we have any evidence of their, their current status of one or other of them at this time. So, that adds to my further concern about exactly what's going on here. So I don't know, I think the General probably has a much more broader perspective for I think all of us. This is a highly emotional issue.
No, I think, look, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't believe in the rule of law, and they look at this as a geopolitical issue, not a domestic legal issue. I do think eventually this is going to end up in some kind of swap. I think the way that it will probably have to play out is we'll have to allow due process to run its course. That's the way our system works. But I think after that's done, assuming that, and I do believe the Department of Justice has put together a strong case against Meng Wanzhou. I mean, Huawei has been selling stuff through subsidiaries to Iran in violation of sanctions. And she has, clearly, done some things that really builds a strong case, or we wouldn't be in this issue. So I think that due process has to happen, but then I think we have to realize that the Chinese Communist Party never intended to enter the international order in a way that was mutually beneficial. It was really on their own terms. And that's just unacceptable. It's unacceptable to our citizens. It's unacceptable to promotion of our societies. And so, I envision at some point, once the due process has run its course, that there is going to be a swap, because that's the only way I think the Chinese Communist Party is willing to come to terms. It's a geopolitical problem. It's a power problem. It's not to them a legal problem. The rule of law has no meaning. Due process has no meaning. You just look at their own legal system. It is what the Chinese law is what the Chinese Communist Party says it is. So, it's a terrible, horrible thing. But during the Cold War, there were many people that were in prison, spent a long time. And it's something that we have to recognize that we're in and work together to, protect our citizens, protect our people, and promote our values. That's the only way we get through this. If we succumb to the coercion and the bullying by the Chinese Communist Party, they will have won.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, to Dr. Burton, to General Spalding, Lieutenant Commander St. Pierre. Thanks, Mike. I enjoyed doing this with you. And to all of you, if you've enjoyed this conversation, if you've enjoyed these exchange calls, please spread the word. You can go to our website, canadastrongandfree.network. Get on our list so that we can bring others on. I'm just looking at my inbox, a lot of positive feedback on this discussion, so I'm encouraged, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future. Also, our events coming up November 6th, 7th on our website. Encourage you to check those out. And until next month, thank you all again, and we'll talk to you then. Bye for now.
Thank you, Michael. Great honor again, General.
Thank you. Good
Bye,
to see you
Troy.
again, Dr. Burton. Bye-bye.
Bye.